So normally you see the screen now, and as Jean-Luc already introduced, indeed I will talk about global change today, and more specifically about the effects of land use history on and other global change drivers on temperate herb layer composition and function using a coordinated approach. So Jean-Luc already told, I started my career focusing on the understory, and also today this will be the main focus of the talk. However, the things that we will discuss today can be seen as representative for also other communities subjected to global change. So it's a case in a larger context. And so yeah, today we'll talk about forests, and forests are at least in Belgium, but I also know in other countries in Europe and worldwide, they're really in the spotlights these days. There's a big interest in forests. Has to do with climate change, but also more generally because people are attracted to these ecosystems. And you see a lot of material appearing in literature dealing with forests, in more kitchen-related aspects related to forests, and also what I call storytelling and forests. So forests are key focus of attention, and this of course has to do with the fact that forests contribute many things to people. They provide material and non-material goods, and they provide a lot of regulating functions. So they really contribute to the quality of life. Now, when people talk about or think about forests, they mostly think, obviously, quite logically, I would say, about the trees. However, in forests, there's more than trees. There is also this herb layer, and here you see a picture of the bluebells in the Hallerbos, just south of Brussels, that attracts 10,000s of people every year to watch to this spectacular view every year. But also, yeah, other species can be very appealing, like the allium species here, or the primula species that you see on this picture. So today we will focus on this layer, the so-called herb layer. And just for your understanding, I briefly want to define this layer once again. So when we talk about the herb layer in forests, we talk about woody and non-woody vascular plants, typically lower than 1 meter or 1.5 meters. So that means that also the tree seedlings, for instance, that are passing through this herb layer, that they are part of the herb layer. And then above, you've got the shrub layer, and then obviously also the tree layer. But today we focus on this herb layer. And the reason why we focus on the herb layer is that, on the one hand, that it's an interesting subject to study elements of global change and also the effects of land use history, but also because from a more functional perspective and ecological perspective, these herb layers are really important components in forests and temperate forests more specifically. And this paper written by Frank Gilliam in 2007 is one of these seminal papers that has put the herb layer in the spotlight. And an interesting quote from Frank Gilliam in this paper is what I typed there above, is that when he was still a student, he was with a professor of forestry in the forest and dared to ask about a particular forest herb species. And then the professor said, "Oh, that's just a stopover. Let's look at the trees." So for a long time, this herb layer has been ignored, despite the important ecological significance. Indeed, in temperate forests, this herb layer comprise the vast majority of vascular plant diversity. So for biodiversity, it's very important. And also, well, it's important to note that when you look at the diversity of the trees, you do not necessarily look at the diversity of the understory, because to some extent they're disconnected. And that's what we shown here in this paper, where we looked across Europe in forests from monoculture stands to 2, 3, 4 species mixture stands, and we could notice that actually there was not a connection, not a clear connection between overstory and understory. So in that sense, these layers are also disconnected. However, if we then move to real ecosystem functions, then this forest herb layer is also more important than one often thinks. In this review paper, we looked at 4 different ecological functions and quantified the contribution of the herb layer to that function in a temperate forest ecosystem. And when you look, for instance, at productivity, so the amount of biomass produced annually, or the amount of litter produced annually, I have to say, then you see that when you only focus on the non-woody material, that up to 20% of the annual litter production comes from the herb layer. But then if you look what's in the litter, then you will see that in terms of nutrient content, so you see nitrogen, phosphorus, magnesium, and so on, that the nutrient content of the herb layer litter is much higher than the tree species litter, up to 3-4 times higher. So in terms of nutrient cycling, this should not be ignored. And then another function is evapotranspiration, so the amount of water that is evaporated yearly from a forest. And there you can see that the herb layer can contribute, certainly in somewhat more open forests, to a large extent to this forest evapotranspiration. And then finally, obviously, the herb layer is also very important, actually, in determining the future of the forest, because it acts as a filter for tree regenerations. Tree seedlings, they have to pass through this herb layer to grow and to survive. And in that sense, the herb layer can really act as a filter and can filter out some species, whereas others aren't. So also that is obviously an important function of the herb layer. Now, of course, this here is also a very important function. That's the cultural function. Forests are very appealing thanks to this herb layer. Now, if you look at a temperate forest, and that's where we will focus on today, then their global distribution is situated mostly on the northern hemisphere, so Europe, northeastern Asia, and northeast and also northwest America. A little bit in the southern hemisphere, but in total they comprise 16% of the global forest area, representing 650 million hectares out of the more or less 4 billion hectares of forest that there is still worldwide. So an important forest type. However, these temperate forests, they are also located in the most densely populated places on Earth. You see this in Europe, you see this in Northeast America, and you see this in Northeast Asia. So that means that they have a very long history of disturbance by humans. And are actually subjected to many global change drivers. And that is here highlighted in the recent IPBES report, where for, in this case, temperate and boreal forests, the authors of this report, they assessed the different global change drivers and their impact during the last 20 years. And then when you look at temperate and boreal forests, then you can actually make this distinction between what we could call old drivers and new drivers. Since these forests are located in the most densely populated areas on Earth, and these are areas that have been densely populated for a long time already, very often, that means that factors such as land use change and also management, extraction of biomass, of material from these forests has a very, very long history. Now you will also see that the trends in those drivers are a little bit variable. It's not that they have strongly increased or systematically increased. It depends a little bit on the region and on the place where you are, whether the impact of these drivers has decreased or increased. However, on top of these old drivers, there's also this series of newer drivers. Climate change, alien species, pollutions, and there the trend is still clearly rising wherever you are. So we have this layer of old drivers, and on top of that, there are new drivers, drivers of change added. And yeah, to give you a more specific example, I will focus here on northern Belgium, so on Flanders, so the Flemish region. And when we talk about land use history and past land use, this is certainly one of the more extreme regions. So there's a very long history of deforestation and also reforestation, making that the current forest area is actually a true mixture of so-called ancient forest and recent forests. And recent forest in Flanders or Belgium, we define this as forest established after 1775. It was the time when the Ferraris maps were made. And then so recent forest established after 1775, and only a small share, only 15% of ancient forests. So forests that existed already in 1775, and many of them existed way back, but for sure, some of them have been cleared in the past, in the more distant past as well. So if you look at the map, you see this picture where in green are the recent forests, so established after 1775. In black are the ancient forests, and in red are all the forests that have disappeared since 1775. So a highly dynamic land use, and you also encounter this in many other regions throughout Europe. Now, land cover is one thing, but also the way the forest was used has changed a lot, as you certainly all know. So in this area, we come from a period where forests were extremely heavily used. A lot of biomass in all different sorts and forms was extracted. This is a picture from the early 20th century taken close to my hometown where I was born, near Turnhout. And then you see this typical copies with standards in the back, and this lady carrying out fodder out of the forest. So very intense management. So, but on this layer of old drivers of change is then this new layer of newer drivers, and then the more important ones in this region or in Northwestern Europe in general are pollution, and specifically then the deposition of acidifying and eutrifying elements, and also still more recently the changing climate. Now, a lot of drivers, a lot of change happening. So if you want to, on the one hand, understand what these drivers are doing with the forest, and in our case, specifically then with the herb layer, but also if we want to try to attempt to make predictions for the future on how these forests will develop, given that climate change will advance, given that nitrogen deposition will also change in the future, then we really need to go into details. Then we really need to understand the processes. And conceptually, this may look relatively simple, and that's what the scheme depicts here on the left hand. So we have these global change drivers. They affect the overstory, so the trees and the shrub layer. And then this tree and the shrub layer influence the understory, so the herb layer. But of course, there's also this direct effect of this global change driver on the understory. And what we want to do is disentangle the relative importance of these different pathways and of the different drivers that determine change. So conceptually, it's simple, but forests are complex ecosystems, as you all know. And if you then try to look at all the different components, all the different driver, all the different compartments in a forest, then the picture becomes quite challenging, with all these interactions taking place in a forest ecosystem. So that means that if you really want to achieve an understanding of global change impacts, and if you want to be able to make predictions, then actually a coordinated approach is needed. And this brings me back to the title of my talk, where this term coordinated approach has been mentioned. And actually this term is proposed by Luo et al. In Global Change Biology. And what they claim, or what they say, is if you really want to understand global change and the effects that it brings, then you have to combine observations, gradient studies, surveys, monitorings, so observational work with also experimental work. So you really need experiments to tease factors apart, and then try to bring it all together in modeling and synthesis. And this this framework proposed by Luo et al. Is also the framework that inspired me for this talk, but also inspired me for the research that we did during the last 6-7 years on this topic. Now, of course, another thing we have to take into account, and in this conference this is particularly relevant, of course, is that we have to look at the factor time. Now, when you look at forest dynamics, we really have to, and dynamics in general, ecosystem dynamics, we really have to also make this time axis explicit and recognize that there are responses taking place on the short, but also on the longer term. And this is nicely conceptualized by Melinda Smith already back in 2009, where she proposed a so-called hierarchical response framework, where on the x-axis we have the time, and on the y-axis we have an ecosystem response, could be whatever, herb layer cover or tree growth, doesn't matter, response to a certain global change drivers or to multiple global change drivers. And then what a system typically does is that there's fast responses taking place within a growing season or even on shortened time spans where individuals adapt. Then gradually, as time moves on, the abundances of the different species in the community, they start to change, and we get species reordering. And then finally, when time moves on more, we get local extinction of species, but also colonization of other species. And that leads to these non-linear responses that you get over time. So that also means that that if you have observed a response here on this short term, that you cannot do a linear interpolation, that's this gray line here, to also predict what the longer term responses could be. So therefore, when you study these things, you have to look at both the short and the longer term. And to do so, we use these different approaches proposed by Luo et al. So I start now with the first bunch of work, and that is the observational work. So where we start from long-term observations, and here I have to nuance a little bit because I watched yesterday's keynote, and then we were talking about not millions, but thousands of years. Here with long-term, we mean observation taking place multiple decades, so 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So what we did in this work is we, over the years, and started more or less in the year 2012, we started collecting so-called resurvey pairs. That means that we search for studies that were out there, published in literature or available in someone's drawer, where the person has resurveyed old vegetation plots that were spatially georeferenced, so you could go back to them more or less precisely and then resurvey the plot, do a new survey, so that you can compare the old survey 20, 30, 40 years ago, done for the first time, and then with a new observation. Now, this database is called Forest Replot, and has developed over the years, and now at this moment it already contains more than 4,900 resurvey pairs from 91 data sets with multiple decades between the survey. Now, what this data set specifically has as a character is that most of the surveys that we have in here come from ancient semi-natural woodland. So it's more or less a criterion also that we use to obtain studies, but that means that, for instance, effects of past cultivation versus permanent forest cover, that cannot be studied with this database. However, we can look at another human factor that has strongly shaped our forest, and that's the past forest management. And within the data set, there's quite a variability of management practices, historical and present practices, ranging from typical coppice with standards management in the past to zero management right now, or to a high forest management, and so on. Good. And so what have we learned now over the years from this database? Well, maybe before delving in the results, I would like to maybe also say a few words about this conceptual graph, because that actually is also the underpinning of the work that we are doing on this forestry plot database. So the reason why we start combining these resurveys from multiple regions is that this really is necessary to be able to disentangle the effects of the different global change drivers. And that is conceptualized here on this graph. And what you see there is 5 regions, 5 resurvey studies coming from different regions, located in different regions. Here with contrasting temperature, for instance, a cold region, an intermediate region, and a very warm region. And within that region, we have these resurvey plots. Those are the circles there. And then within the region, you see that there is also a difference in how the canopy, for instance, has changed in the forest. In some, it has become much more open. In others, it has become much more closed. So at the plot scale, you've got this variability in canopy opening. But if you want to understand the effects of plot scale, but of canopy opening, I mean, but also want to understand whether the effects of the canopy opening differs in warmer regions versus in cooler regions, then you really need to combine biodiversity resurveys. And therefore, you really need a database like this one, where from multiple regions with contrasting environments, that you have data from, so that you can disentangle the effects of more large-scale varying variables such as nitrogen deposition and macroclimatic change versus very local effects of changes in management. So that's the idea behind the database and behind the work that we did on it. And then now to some results. So if we now look back over the 9-10 years of work that has been done on forestry plots, you can basically summarize it into 3 main findings. And the first finding is, and this is also consistent with other studies, is that if you look at the diversity change over time, so number of species or the Shannon index, that generally you don't see a clear pattern. Generally, on average, there is no change in diversity. And this here is exemplified in this graph from 23 data sets depicted here. And then you see that when you look at the change of diversity over time, that goes up and down, but there's no clear overall trend. However, the fact that there's no consistent change in diversity does not mean that the communities do not change. No, they do change. They do change significantly. And we do see, indeed, large shifts in composition. And here's just one example focusing on a particular species, Liana species, in European temperate forests. And this recent paper by Mike Perring showed that particularly Hydra helix is really strongly increasing in frequency and to some extent in abundance across Europe in a quite consistent way. So communities are changing, but the richness, diversity as such is not. And then if you want to go deeper and understand, okay, what now drives these changes, then what appears from multiple studies is that actually past management and changes and related to that changes in canopy, density, and composition are in fact the most important drivers. So it's not so much nitrogen deposition, it's not so much climate warming that is actually already driving most of the changes. It's really these changes in the canopy, in these, as I said, mostly ancient forests here, that are key drivers. However, interactions with other drivers are common. And here I show you one example of an interaction between past management and effects of climate warming. This comes from a paper that Peter de Vrenne already published back in 2013, but was recently confirmed in another paper by Florian Zellweger, using a somewhat different approach and also a different angle, but the story is very similar. What you see is that when we talk about climate warming, that in general, yes, there is a thermophilization of the herb layer, so more and more species are accumulating that are indicative of more warmer conditions. However, there's a very strong effect of the canopy. So when over time the canopy has become denser, so more closed since the first survey, then we don't see this thermophilization. We only see it in cases where the canopy has opened up over time. There we see this clear thermophilization signal. And so this applies to climate warming, but this also applies to nitrogen deposition. So this is other work by Mike Perring. And there he showed actually that in this case, past management regimes, so here the contrast copies with standards in the year 1800 versus forests that were managed as high forest in 1800, that these two contrasting forests in terms of management regimes, that the response of the herb layer, in this case in terms of the changes in vegetation height, are very different when you plot them along a nitrogen deposition gradient. So in the coppice with standards forest, you see in general decreasing mean height of the herb layer, whereas in high forest, forests that were managed as high forest, you see an increasing height of the vegetation with increasing nitrogen deposition. The mechanisms here are not so clear, but most importantly here, as take home, is that there is this interaction between past management, aspect of land use history, and nitrogen deposition as global change driver. Now, good. So that's about forestry plots. So the exploitation of this database, but databases, of course, also have limitations. The methods, the way the surveys were done, the timing when the surveys were done very often differs between the studies. So you want to exclude to some extent this methodological variability, and also you want to collect a bit more site information on where the plots were collected, information on the soil, on the litter type, and so on. So therefore, as part of my ERC project, we were able to do a big campaign throughout Europe, ranging from UK to Slovakia, and all the way up to Latvia, where we collected vegetation data in forests where there were also historic surveys available. This time we could survey both ancient and post-agricultural forests, so we could take this land cover and land use aspect into account. And what you see on the right hand here is that we were able to sample along broad environmental gradients, mean annual temperature, nitrogen deposition, and precipitation. So in total, it's more or less 200 plots that we were able to sample. And in all those plots, so the team went and took the vegetation survey, but we also collected a lot of other information on the soil, on the tree growth, on the litter layer, and so on. And this work, on the one hand, has helped us to better understand what actually these canopy effects that we observed in the first part of the presentation, what these canopy effects actually mean and how they play out. And I give you a few examples of what we found. And the first example here is focusing on microclimate, which is a hot topic these days. And within this network of plots, we could clearly establish that these microclimates in these forest plots, that they are especially in summertime, and especially for the maximum temperatures, that they are strongly buffered. And we could also establish that, which is of course also expected, of course, that it very much depends on the degree of canopy cover, how much this buffering is. But interesting, most interesting, I think, that we found is this clear nonlinear relationship, where you see that when the canopy cover goes over 100%, that the change in buffering, what's here on the y-axis, that there's hardly any change anymore, but it's within this zone between 40–50% canopy cover and 100% canopy cover that the big changes in buffering took place. And this helps to explain, for instance, the example that I gave on the thermophilization of the forest herb layer. But we also looked into the soil, and for the soil, we could actually also establish that relative to nitrogen deposition, the soil type, texture, and so on, that actually the composition of the canopy composition was a more important driver affecting the topsoil chemical characteristics. For instance, the variable that stood out really most significantly was the quality of the litter of the tree canopy, affecting the litter layer at the forest floor, affecting the CN ratio, affecting the base saturation. So relative to the other global change drivers, this canopy composition again is a very, very important driving variable. And then focusing again more on the herb layer, this detailed work also allowed us to better understand what actually drives the biomass of the herb layer. There's a big variability, as you probably all know, when you wander around in forests. Sometimes there's hardly any herb layer. In other places there is much more developed herb layer. So there's indeed this big range in herb layer biomass that's available. And this work also then helped to understand what now really drives this variability. And obviously it is light. This is certainly not surprising. More light, a higher biomass. And also the soil characteristics, especially then a low CN ratio. However, like in the previous example, it was mostly this, actually again, this canopy characteristics that determined the variability in the biomass, and less so the other global change drivers. Again, pinpointing to the importance of the herb layer. Sorry, of the canopy. And then going on with the herb layer community, we then looked again, like in the previous studies, to changes in species richness across all these sites, and there the result was consistent. No change, no systematic change. However, if you then look at a few functional characteristics of the herb layer, like the total cover of the herb layer or the plant height as an important functional trait, then we did see some significant changes over time. And again, we try to explain this. And that's what you see in this graph. Biodiversity changes were quite variable and were hard to explain. Functional changes were we could explain much better. So the predictive power of these models was much higher. And again, what pops up here is that this combination of land use history and management, so the past management reflected in the canopy characteristics, was really important to explain these functional changes over time. Here we also saw a clear interaction between past management and the past land use, in the sense that, for instance, if we give here the example of specific leaf area, that in the ancient forest we see the expected response that as the canopy gets more closed over time, that we see a positive change in the specific leaf area, that's expected. But then in the recent forest, this trend is not obvious. Good, so that summarizes this part here. So what have we now learned from this observational work is that quite consistently we don't see changes in diversity. We do see a large shift in taxonomic and also functional composition, and that past land use and changes in canopy density and composition, which is then most often related to changes in management, forest management, are the most important drivers. But interactions with other drivers like climate warming and nitrogen deposition are common. Good. Then the last bit, or the next element actually of Lou's scheme, where we have this coordinated approach, is that you need to complement such observational work with experimental work. And that's what we did also as part of this ERC project, is we set up a large experiment here in our experimental forest in near Ghent. And what we did is we collected soil from ancient forest and also post-agricultural forest, because the chemical characteristics are typically different in these soils. Also, the soil biotic community will be different. So we had land use and differences in land use as a starting point. So we collected soil and subjected that soil, together with the plant community growing on it, to environmental or global change drivers, being warming, nitrogen addition. So we added nitrogen, and we also added light or not. So with this disentangling of warming and illumination, we could look at possible effects of climate warming per se, so just a warmer macroclimate versus an opening up of a canopy where both warming and extra illumination will take place. So that's the basic setup of the experiment. And since we wanted to be able to get some general conclusions, we collected soil throughout Europe in different environmental contexts. So in regions where there's typically a very low nitrogen deposition and where the agricultural system is not that intense, so that there's not a surplus of phosphorus at the landscape scale, for instance here in Estonia. But then also at the other extreme, and the other extreme is here where I live, that's high nitrogen deposition and a high surplus of phosphorus, so very intense agriculture, and everything in between. So we drove around with a van throughout Europe to collect the soil. Here you see the big bags of soil in our small greenhouse here at the lab. And actually then, of course, did some chemical analysis on that, and then we're able to confirm that indeed there are these expected differences in chemical composition between soil from ancient and from recent forest, and that's what you see depicted here with the higher phosphorus concentration in the post-agricultural soil. However, what came out also, and was quite interesting, is that this difference in phosphorus concentration is really context dependent, and it correlates very well with this regional phosphorus surplus that's out there. And so, for instance, you see very high and very big differences in, for instance, a Flemish context with very intense agriculture, but then much more moderate differences in regions like Estonia, where the agricultural intensity is significantly lower. So that's the soil characterization, and then we made mesocosms. So we filled these curver boxes delivered to the lab with the soil that we collected, and we planted these mesocosms with forest herbs. So we used a pool of 15 species that we considered to be representative of forest communities. So where we have typical slow colonizing Asian woodland herbs, fast colonizing species, such as Ranunculus vicaria, for instance, and then also more competitive species. Then replications and so on, and in total we had 384 of these mesocosms that we took out to our experimental forest, which is here just across the street. We brought them all there and then installed the treatments. So what you see here is a plot that gets extra light, but is not warmed. So the warming is something that you see in the back with these so-called open top chambers, where we can warm the soil with 1.5 degrees Celsius. And then on some of these mesocosms, extra nitrogen was added, and on others, nothing. Good. So what comes out? Well, actually, a quite consistent story. And the first result that I show is from an earlier study that, again, Peter de Vrenne did, but not with mesocosms, just installed on the naturally growing forest communities. And there, what we clearly found was, again, that light was the most determining factor, causing the biggest shift between the control sites that received nothing and the treatment sites. So, for instance, warming alone. So, if the macroclimate warms alone, but the canopy stays closed and there's no extra light, then the changes in the community are actually not that large. So that was the observation done by Peter, but the same observation is the observation that we made in the mesocosms that I just shown. If you compare here the control with then the illuminated plots, then you see here in this case the biggest difference in cover. So light again is here a very, very important factor. And what was also striking in this experiment is that when we analyzed all the factors and also all the interactions, is that in this case, unlike in the observational studies, but that span, of course, over 20, 30, 40 years, we survey intervals, that here we could not detect interactions. It was a pure effect of temperature and light. Those were the most important effects, and light was then the most important. But interactions apparently had not developed. I put here the word yet because we continue to monitor this experiment, and now they start to gradually appear, although not very strong yet. But that's the striking difference between the experimental work and then the observational, more longer-term work. And then the advantage of having an experiment on site is that you can also look not only at the herb layer, but then also at the functioning of the whole system. And we, among others, looked, for instance, also at the way the treatments and the herb layer affected the microbial community. And then, again, light was a very important factor here, showing that the biomass of the bacterial community in particular was much lower when the plots were lit versus when they were not lit. And this had to do with the fact that there were probably less root exudates in the illuminated plots, so that the bacteria had less to eat, so to say. So that's the bacterial community, but you can go on to different functions. For instance, if another important function in forests is nutrient cycling and litter decomposition. And we used these mesocosms also to place some tea bags to look at the decomposition of different types of tea, so the slowly decomposing rooibos tea and the better decomposing green tea. And the most important and interesting finding here is actually that there is a very important indirect effect actually of these global change drivers via the herb layer on the decomposition. So here we know that light and temperature are very important for the plant cover, and it increases because of these factors, but this increasing cover of the herb layer decreases the decomposition rate of both the green tea and the rooibos tea, probably because of the altered microclimate, and more specifically because of the probably somewhat drier conditions because of this expanding herb layer. Okay, good. I'm almost at the end of my talk. So coming back to this slide, so I stressed in the beginning that such a coordinated approach is needed to really understand the different driver, their relative importance, and also the way they interact. And by doing these experiments and these database and designed observatories, I think we to some extent succeeded in getting a handle on the understanding. And so that brings me then to the key messages that come out of all this work is that I think the first thing is obvious, that clearly herb layers are important for the conservation, that's known, but also for the functioning of temperate forest ecosystems. However, more research is needed on this functional role. That's still an area of research that's underexplored to my view. It's also clear that over time and because of global change that herb layers are changing both taxonomically and also functionally, and that here, if you look across the different drivers, that actually the old drivers, being the legacies of land use and management, that they are still the most important driving these changes. So history is clearly important, and this is probably something that I don't have to tell this public, but take history into account when you want to make predictions for the future. And that's the effect of other more recent global change drivers, such as nitrogen depositions, that they're there, but that they're mostly interacting actually with the other drivers, and then most specifically with the canopy changes. Now, so if you then go back to this scheme here, then you can actually depict the current picture like this. When we look at what now matters for understory functioning and composition, so what drives change there, then it's currently mostly still the overstory that matters, and these global change drivers, they have a somewhat less important role still. However, this may be the current situation, but maybe this is not going to be the future situation, because what we now see throughout Europe, and also, for instance, in northeastern France in particular, is that global change is currently really affecting the overstory. We have ash dieback on the one hand, but we have also the effects of the recurrent droughts that kill trees and that open up the canopy. And so maybe the relative importance of the effects of the global change drivers and the canopy as such may change in the future, and maybe if this opening up of the canopy takes place rapidly, that maybe we may experience very sudden and big shifts in the understory, so herb layer composition and functioning as depicted by these trajectories here. So that's still out there as a question. And with that, I would like to end my presentation. Thanks a lot for listening. And if you want to have more info on the project, please go to this website, where you can watch also a movie, The Story of the Understory. Then also recently we added a decision support tool that we are developing that helps predicting or does a first effort, let's say, to help predict changes in understory composition and functioning as a result of different combinations of global change drivers. Good, I thank you for your attention, and I